right, that was a local conversation, what's taking place here in Houston. Next, we're going to turn to Lexi Branson. She's in from the U.S. Chamber, and it will be a fruitful opportunity to see other activity that's going on around the country. Lexi Branson is the Vice President of Health Policy at the U.S. Chamber, where she leads national healthcare policy and advocacy efforts. She brings extensive experience in government, industry, and public affairs, including leadership roles at pharma and at the White House. She's joined by Ryan Urgo, Vice President and Head of U.S. Public Policy at Eli Lilly, where he leads strategy and engagement on key healthcare policy issues affecting biopharmaceutical industry. With leadership experience across Lilly, Novo Nordisk, and Avelar Health, he specializes in translating complex policy challenges into actionable strategies that shape public policy and market access outcomes. With that, I'd like to welcome Ryan and Lexi to the stage. Thank you. Thank you for being here.
These good? Okay. Now, Ryan and I have a tough job, and that is keeping you guys entertained before cocktail hour. But we're going to do it, and it's going to be great. So, as mentioned, I have the unique job of running health policy at the U.S. Chamber, where we represent businesses of every size and every sector, like Eli Lilly. So I have my colleague here with me today, Ryan Urgo, who, despite my many times failing to describe this correctly when we were practicing beforehand, I gave him a lot of demotions and promotions, but he runs U.S. policy for Eli Lilly. I promised him I would get that right this time. And when we were talking about this, we were talking a lot about how we would talk about the U.S. perspective on brain health. It's a big role for us here, and there's a lot of responsibility in making sure that we get this right. So we really wanted to kind of set the stage and make sure that when we're talking about this with you all, that we're addressing kind of what really matters in this day and age, right? Well, at the U.S. Chamber, when I talk to my members, what's really keeping them up at night, the conversation has kind of shifted, right? No longer is it about what is brain health, it's more about how is brain health impacting workforce. It's a loss in productivity, it's economic loss, right? And really, we've seen a major change because now we have some of the tools in order to really make a difference. But when Ryan and I were discussing this, we found that there's really an opportunity for us to actually use these tools. So the question that we were talking about is, it's no longer whether we can actually address brain disease, it's whether our policies and our payment systems can actually keep up, right? So now that I've introduced you correctly, I think that we can dive in, and I promise we will entertain you for the next 18 minutes and 24 seconds, and then you have only one more panel to get through before cocktail hour. So first, one of the payment policies that we were talking about, one of the systems, the largest in the United States today is Medicare. And when we were talking about this, we discussed that Medicare was not built for brain health, right? It wasn't built for the brain health era. So tell me more about what you meant when we were discussing that.
Yeah, so we could probably start with just a statistic. We spend $5 trillion a year on healthcare on average. Of that $5 trillion, 3% at most goes to prevention. And furthermore, of that $5 trillion, about 90% of that spending is on chronic disease. So while it might sound a bit cliched, it is not an understatement to say that we have a bit of a sick care system rather than a healthcare system. And if you trace the origin of that back, you could probably point to Medicare in 1965. And if you look at the way Medicare is just structured generally, it's an acute care program. So you get sick after a diagnosis, and then you receive treatment. What Medicare doesn't really accommodate is coverage for prevention. In fact, Medicare is statutorily prohibited from covering preventive items and services. And if you take Alzheimer's disease as just a perfect example, we know that the signs and pathology of Alzheimer's manifest maybe 15, 20 years before a patient is actually symptomatic. So if you're only able through Medicare to get coverage for and treatment until you've reached a diagnosis, by then it unfortunately might be too late. And the science is increasingly pointing to the fact that earlier intervention may have the best prospects on long-term outcomes. So, the science is moving ahead, and we're really just not there yet from a Medicare perspective.
Yeah, I think that also from the employee side too, we're seeing this in terms of loss of productivity too, and then also and just in the numbers, right? So I guess where do you see that mismatch in terms of actual policy, right?
Yeah, I think just going back to the structural problems with Medicare, I think really what it stems from is Medicare's reasonable and necessary policy. That's in statute. That's Section 1862 of the Social Security Act. And essentially what it says is that Medicare will only cover things that are for diagnosis and treatment of illness or injury. What it also means is that there is no benefit at all for prevention. There's no screening benefit. Blood-based biomarkers in the context of Alzheimer's, I think, are a good example. They are covered in patients that are symptomatic, but if you are seeking out coverage of a blood-based biomarker in an asymptomatic patient that has no cognitive impairment, so you would maybe think of that as the Alzheimer's stage 1 or 2, or preclinical would be another term. There's no coverage for blood-based biomarkers in that context. And you would think that if we were focused on really getting to the root cause of Alzheimer's and stopping it from the beginning, that we wouldn't have that type of kind of artificial bright line between screening and treatment. Just a few other things to state the obvious. Medicare is also very siloed, right? Part A, Part B, Part D. That doesn't really lend itself to whole person healthcare. So that's another constraint. And I would just say one more statistic. We have about 10,000 people aging into Medicare per day. So if you think about that, we need system reform in order to address all of the costs that will come late in life associated with that kind of population size.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. And also, no offense to our Australian friend in the back, when we were talking about the United States, I think we're so competitive here because of our fantastic employer-provided coverage system. But I do think that these government systems like Medicare really set the stage here. And when we're talking about those silos, we really do feel that because there's not really a whole of patient approach. And these silos are really difficult when you're trying to break through because it affects not only the patient, but the employee and the employer. And when employer provided coverage, when our employers are really trying to provide these unique benefits, like this fantastic mental health care, or trying to provide these preventative care aspects like the biomarkers and all these different diagnostic tests, if they're not seeing this set in practice and how it's been beneficial in other areas, they can't lead or they can't follow an example, right? There's just so much missing. Now, one thing that you've talked about and one thing that Eli Lilly has just been fantastic really and really truly leading in this example is setting the pace in terms of science and technology. And you just have the coolest job because you get to talk about policy and also the proof's in the pudding, right? But do you feel like policy is keeping up with how fast you guys are moving?
Not quite. And I think that really gets to the essence of the problem. The science is moving pretty quickly. But I think from a policy perspective, there's been some progress, but there are certainly gaps. At Lilly, we support what we would call a precision prevention framework, which is to say prevention in the traditional sense is vital. Healthy eating, sleep, diet, exercise, all of the behavior modifications that are important. But we also think that prevention in that context should be inclusive of modernization of Medicare payments so that we are better accommodating coverage for both screening and treatment, and at the same time making room for personalized treatments that have either a substantial benefit in halting disease progression or in just an outright primary preventive benefit. If you think about where a lot of the research is, not just at Lilly, but a lot of other pharma companies, gene therapy is a really exciting space. siRNA technology is another area where when you're pairing those type of personalized therapeutics with a screening tool, you could substantially halt some of the worst diseases that that currently ravage the healthcare system. But we need a payment system that encourages that kind of a model. And there's a whole set of policies that I think can help us get there.
Okay, well, let's get into it. So at a system-wide level, just looking at Medicare,
Yeah.
if you could point to some specific changes that you'd like to see in Medicare in order to really make a difference here, what would you point to first?
In an ideal world, the first thing I would point to is I'd go back to the reasonable and necessary statute. Either through legislation or regulation, you could amend that definition to accommodate coverage for items and services that have a preventive benefit. That in and of itself would immediately break down that artificial firewall between whether something is prevention and screening versus treatment. So that would be a big one. And you could do that legislatively. You could also do that through the regulatory process. Another big one is the United States Preventative Health Services Task Force, USPSTF. We know that an AB recommendation from USPSTF is binding on ACA plans, but Medicare has no obligation to cover items and services that receive that preventive recommendation. New legislation that extended those recommendations to Medicare might make a lot of sense because for the first time, we would have a uniform preventive recommendation across both the private and public market. I would say even procedurally, under USPSTF's existing authority, there are some things that we can do to modernize their process. They could move a little faster with their cycle time. They could be a little bit more open-minded with the type of evidence that they look at when they make their recommendations. And there could just be a little bit more transparency overall into their process. So I understand that maybe in this moment, USPSTF reform may not be the best timing, but that's another area that I think we should give some strong consideration to. Of course, an outright new benefit category in Medicare for screening would be huge. And the last thing that I would just flag is CMMI. The Innovation Center we can't discount as a bridge towards permanent reform. And there are lots of existing models that we could refine right now that would accommodate more of a preventive benefit. And of course, there are new model concepts as well that we've been giving a lot of thought to. Just by way of one quick example, the private sector also has a disincentive to cover expensive treatments and services that have a preventive benefit because of beneficiary churn. Could we envision a CMMI model where you have Medicare and the private sector working jointly in some sort of joint shared savings model that changes the way we think about the financing of these types of items and services?
And you think a new model from CMMI is a good idea?
Which one?
I don't know, just any new one. I've been a little discouraged lately, but maybe there's something positive out there. But I do have to ask, you didn't mention my favorite one, CBO.
Yes. Well, where I think you might be going is the Preventative Health Services Act is another great piece of legislation that would enable the budget office to score preventive benefits on a 30-year window instead of a 10-year window. And what that would do is it would allow for CBO to book as savings more of the downstream savings that accrue later on outside of a traditional 10-year window. And we would not be at the mercy of CBO determining whether or not certain pieces of legislation with a preventive benefit, live or die. So I know you're probably pretty excited about that one too
I
at the
am,
chamber.
if you can't tell. I just think it's such a great idea. I mean, the U.S. Chamber has been lobbying for this for a long time. We think it's extremely important, especially when you're looking at preventative care, because everything looks expensive when you're only looking at the benefit of something for only 10 years. So when you're looking at the cost-benefit analysis for prevention, and it's such a short time frame, I mean, it's time that Congress zooms out. So you can count us in to be a partner for you there. So yeah, I'm jazzed about this one, and I'm happy to talk to you guys more about it. Now, specifically for brain health, let's talk about what the near-term policy agenda looks like.
Yeah, brain health, I think that the number one thing could be maybe more CMS flexibility as it relates to coverage. In Alzheimer's disease right now, for disease-modifying therapies, it's basically the only class where you don't have automatic coverage when you have a new FDA-approved indication. So if there was a scenario where CMS applied a little bit more flexibility and coverage moved in tandem with new FDA-approved indications, you would simply be treating disease-modifying therapies just like every other drug category that's out there. So I think that would be one really important move from a coverage perspective. I would also want to put a plug in for the ASAP Act. That's a great piece of legislation that would, again, in lieu of a screening benefit, a dedicated screening benefit in Medicare, it would create a screening benefit for blood-based biomarkers when they are used for screening. So that's, I know, a piece of legislation that a lot of stakeholders in this space are excited about. And I would go back to CMMI too. You had asked about new models or existing models, and there are at least a couple models out there right now that could be enhanced or refined in ways that create more of an incentive for earlier intervention. So earlier engagement, earlier intervention, and also screening for patients in that pre-symptomatic stage, before they have actually presented with symptoms, but we're still looking to see if there is pathology present, and then if there is, we could potentially engage sooner.
Now, really quickly, is this just a public sector issue, or does this also apply to commercial insurance here?
I think it's very much a commercial market problem as well. To some degree, even more so, because in the commercial market, what we hear is that employee churn and the time horizon problem continues to be a roadblock. So, if you just take an expensive therapeutic, for example, that has either a primary or at least a secondary preventive benefit, there is a reluctance on the part of the private sector to invest in an expensive treatment if they are not going to reap the benefits associated with downstream offsetting medical expenses when that employee or that beneficiary goes somewhere else, like Medicare, right? So I think that there are things that we can consider back to this idea of a public-private CMMI demonstration that tests out whether there can be more partnership there on the financing side. Tax incentives to...
Or ESI,
right?
employer-sponsored insurance. We've found that healthcare lately is the alphabet soup of acronyms. Mm-hmm. It's a lot, but yes, also expanding health savings accounts, HSAs.
Yep.
There's a lot more that we could be doing here just to make sure that we are covering these preventative services.
Yeah. One more very wonky one that I would throw out is medical loss ratio changes. Those are the MLR standards that employers have to hit per the ACA. You could modify that in such a way where an employer is given greater credit towards meeting that medical loss ratio threshold if they are spending money on a dedicated set of preventive items and services. And I think you're right about HSAs. If employers broadened the subset of items and services that qualified under an HSA, that could also create some near-term improvement. So I know we're talking about like big picture system change. Not everything has to be a home run shot. There are things that we can be doing now to set us up on the glide path towards bigger change.
Yeah, I'm in agreement here. Now let's bring this back to the brain capital framing here. Let's tie it together. Bring us home here, Ryan.
Yeah, just to kind of wrap it up, I would just say that we are on the precipice of an extremely exciting time when it comes to science. I'm always amazed when I get updates from folks within my own company about, the new personalized therapeutics that we are investing in, and the science is outpacing where the payment system is. But you would also think in this moment, this administration has really prioritized prevention, and that's a goal I think that we all share. And I think we really have an opportunity to, under that umbrella of prevention, broaden how we think about it. So it accommodates not just lifestyle change, but also modernization to the payment system and Alzheimer's, whether it is on the screening side or on the therapeutic side. I can't think of a better example of something that can help usher us into a new era. So
Perfect.
there's a lot of enthusiasm around the space, especially within the walls of Lilly, just given the decades of investment that we've had in this space.
Well said. Well, thank you, Ryan, and thank you for having us here today. I'll just end with one more thing and say that the Chamber, alongside all of our business community and partners, members, are ready to work with you guys. So please make sure that you have business at the table when you're having these conversations. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.